bringing a supplier on as early as possible lets you design the building to the efficiency of the material and also to the preferences of the fabricator.
Having more communication is always going to yield a more efficient, economical design.
In this episode, learn about procurement options, including the benefits of Design Assist, and how to adapt traditional delivery methods to work better for mass timber construction. Join Senior Principal Paul Becker and Vice President Kristina Rogers, both structural engineers based in Portland, Maine, as they discuss better options for mass timber procurement.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of our Mass Timber podcast. I'm Paul Becker, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kristina Rogers. Kristina and I have been working on a lot of different projects over the last several years. And, one of the things that keeps coming up is the best way to procure mass timber on our projects. And so I thought today we'd see what we come up with.
This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot, and we've seen a lot of different projects with a lot of different approaches to this topic, and they all kind of tend to find their way through different paths, some that we've seen more successful than others, but it really depends on the type of project and the goals of the project.
So, Kristina, how would you characterize the options that we commonly see, and maybe then we can talk a little bit about the things that we prefer, or what we've learned to be perhaps a better way to proceed.
To that point, one of the most successful procurement options is bringing a supplier on as early as possible. And that is because it allows us to kind of hone in on the products and materials that they supply. And knowing that as early as possible lets you design the building to the efficiency of the material and also to the preferences of the fabricator, as opposed to a traditional design bid build where you're kind of taking some guesses. And so say the project goes out at 100% SD, and at that point you put out an RFQ to say, like, what suppliers are interested in this project and are they able to put a price on it at this point? Because then you could bring that supplier on in this design assist role to kind of join the calls, say, here's the species of wood we supply, here's the way we fabricate it, here's our preferences on how we fabricate it, here's the type of connections we like to do. It allows you to start thinking about the construction process and how it might affect the design of the building once you get into DD, which is where you want to start digging into some of those details.
Sure.
Yeah.
So is it fair to say that by using an early release, getting a design assist, bringing the fabricator on, starting to invest, if you will, in their knowledge about their product, their procedures, their fabrication methods, that we can be more economical, both in the design and in the use of material, and maybe speed delivery to the project, and therefore reduce overall project costs? That's one.
Yeah. That's
one approach, right?
Definitely.
Right.
And it's almost thinking of the design assist person is like your live steel manual for timber, right? Which we don't have as like as an industry. We don't have like a single reference guide that says, here's what the typical like purlin to girder connection looks like in every case across the industry.
Right.
And that's where this acronym DFMA comes into play, which is design for manufacturing. How does this supplier want to manufacture it? What products do they manufacture? And you kind of use them as your live source of experience, right? They've worked with their material for years.
Sure.
They know how it works best, what's been most successful, but also what they're capable of.
So let's touch on connection design and how that relates to the procurement of mass timber, because we can get the timber, and then there's options for who is responsible for connection design, right? And similar, let's make the steel analogy again. Similar to steel, right? You can have the engineer record design the connection, or you can have the fabricator or a third party design the connection based on the loads you've given.
Yeah,
we've done this with mass timber both ways. What do you think is maybe advantage, disadvantage, or how you like to handle that piece of it?
But I think it depends on the project and it depends on the partner. I think there's a really nice solution where you bring on the design assist partner and they take responsibility for the connections, because that's their experience. That's they have detailers.
And they know what their shop can produce.
I think a lot of times mass timber projects, when the connections aren't thought of early on, they're almost the governing thing for member sizing, how heavy a load you can handle, geometry of the whole system.
Right.
And if you don't think about it early on, it can really mess with the coordination and sizing of things later on. So I think we've come a long way, and even internally, we have a group with the Mass Timber COP that's starting to like really detail all the options for connections that we've seen and what's available.
COP. Community of practice.
Yeah. So our internal community of practice that like focuses on how we deliver a mass timber project, like disseminating technical information across the company. We've started to develop broader range of typical details that says like, here's all the different ways we've approached connections and here's what you need to think about for each case.
Is it safe to say, I mean, we've had some recent projects with some very complicated geometry, and is it safe or reasonable to make a blanket statement that maybe the more complex geometry, if possible, to have the fabricator handle that as a connection component of their contract?
I think so, but I think even more important to have a concept early on.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
So I've been working pretty in detail on the Samuel Scripps Theater, which is a curved glulam roof for the Hudson Valley Shakespeare. And this is a really complex, non-rectilinear curved roof. And this is an example where we have really complicated connections, and we have we're kind of like pushing the boundaries of curvature on what a fabricator could do. So partnering with a supplier early on, allow them to say like, here's the maximum curve we can put in a member.
Right.
Here's where the splices need to be. Having them as a partner actually helped us refine the geometry to what they were capable of early on.
Right.
And then we had these really complicated connections that we took a stab at. We know we want it to be a bearing connection. We know this one has to be screwed. We know we need long screws here. Like, here's the direction of the forces. And we drew it conceptually. We said, here's how we think this should come together. And then they took it a step further. We think we can dap it in here. We think we can make a nice cut here.
Refine it and to harmonize it with their process, right? With what they can fabricate.
Totally. It's going to be erected. How are we going to drop it in? Then they ended up doing a really nice, like, small cut so it could kind of just sit in place while the screws were being installed. So they refined it to their process. We looked back at it to make sure it was in the matched the structural requirements.
Right.
And it was this really nice back and forth of developing a complicated
I'm curious, did that fabricator also erect the structure?
Because
they seem like they had a large sensitivity to the constructability.
Yeah, they led the erection.
There you go.
Component of it.
So that really speaks to the designing for manufacturing, right? That your design is really responding to what that fabricator can produce it efficiently, and layer in what can be constructed reasonably well and easy.
Well, so now it brings us to another example, which is the Rue Institute, right? Where the supplier was brought on at 100% DD a little bit later in the process, but they came on in the design assist, where we had kind of made some assumptions about who we thought the supplier might be to carry it through. They're actually not the erector on the project, but they still have a lot of say about erection, right? Because timber erection is different than steel erection, and they would say, we imagine it's going to be erected this way, or we prefer for it to be, and they have direct communication with their erector, even though it's not them, to say like, here's the sequencing, here's how the connections fit together. And we have some complicated connections on that one as well, which is really nice. As we developed through 100% CDs in terms of coordination with architect, they were kind of driving forward the connection design, so we could meet in the middle. And then once we issued 100% CDs, they got started on the detailing process. And then a third case study, which I think is worth mentioning, is a small project we're doing in Iowa with a really great developer that's been doing a lot of timber work called Goldfinch Lofts, where the developer was really interested in partnering with the supplier early because they had other projects where the supplier came on later, and they saw kind of the changes that happened down the line. They had to be a little more flexible than they wanted to be. So they said, let's partner with someone early on, and what would that look like? And we actually led the discussion as opposed to the contractor to say, let's set up meetings with fabricators we know and have relationships with them, have really like frank conversations about what we're trying to achieve, get their opinion about the best way to do it. We had some suppliers come to the table and suggest like, hey, have you thought about GLT instead of CLT? It's something we're thinking about lately. Have you thought about continuous 60-foot members instead of like 2-span 40-foot members? And we selected a partner kind of based on those discussions, and we've been working really closely with them from SD. And in that, we are taking on the connection design with them as a partner at the table to say, hey, here's what we're proposing here. Does that make sense? And then it'll come to the call.
So they're adding in what they can build or what they can fabricate easily based on what you're determining is the connection requirements, right?
Exactly.
So you're detailing, designing, taking responsibility for the capacity, the screws, the connector, but they're weighing in on what can they easily fabricate.
Yeah, or they'll say, actually, like in a base column connection, we were putting a gusset plate sticking up.
Sure.
And they were like, actually, we've seen really successful where we make that a tube.
Yeah.
Because it's you have a different type of cut. It's the CNC machine that does it. The two shapes fit together more easily. There's a little less wiggle room. And we were like, great, that's a great idea. We'll refine the detail to reflect that. Yep. And it's this supplier is completely capable of detailing. It was just in this project we took on the detailing, and they worked with us as a partner in that. In the future, maybe we'll work with them on a project where they do the detailing.
I think what's interesting on Goldfinch project, where you sat in on all the interviews with the potential fabricators, suppliers, I think that is really worth noting that I think from our perspective, that's the way forward, to have us included in those early conversations, because we are the prime group that's going to interface with this fabricator.
Yeah.
We understand the requirements of the design, the demands on the structure, and to be able to be at the table and speak and interview, if you will, the different suppliers, I think really makes the design effort from that point forward much more successful.
Yeah, I had a great conversation with a supplier at the Mass Timber Conference where they were like, when we get your drawings blind, we're like, oh, they really want to do the splines this way, and they must have drawn it this way for a very specific reason.
Right.
But if we were at the table and we were like, we drew it that way because we thought maybe that's what you'd want to do, but we're open to this option, this option, this option, then they can tune their pricing to that conversation.
Right.
And we kind of work as direct partners in making the best choices for the project, as opposed to like completely separate making guesses, which is kind of how we started the conversation out.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think having more communication is always going to yield a more efficient, economical design, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're more flexible than people give us credit for, as structural engineers, and I think that's where that approach is really valuable. Having early involvement in the selection, having a close relationship through the design, and then whoever's responsible for connection design, I think as long as we're communicating and involved early on, then it can go very smoothly.
Yeah. And can I throw one more wrench in?
Sure.
So you and I have been working on a proposal for a new project that has some funding from a city.
Yep.
And this happens a lot too, right? Where it's either a university or a state or a city where they're really set up for a traditional design bid build, and that's how their funding works. Right. I don't want to say that mass timber is not a possibility for those scenarios, because it certainly is. I think in that case, we just need to think about how we approach the design bid build to make it successful for timber, to say that is a procurement option. And it happens on a lot of projects where they just need a competitive bid, and you can't really bring someone on early, maybe because of the way that they're systematically set up. In that case, I think you have to play a little bit on the conservative side and make the drawings incredibly clear, more in terms of forces and expectations, as opposed to detailing something in a really specific way,
Right.
and be part of the conversations with the contractors to say, at this point in the game, what's flexible, what's not.
Mhm.
Because you might be so far down the line that you're like, we need a 24-inch deep beam. There's no
Right.
changes in that at this point. So what do we have to do to get that to work within your process? And I think you just have to prepare yourself to be a little more flexible, or leave a little more flexibility in early conversations with the architect.
Mhm.
I think at that point, just having a really experienced team at the table can help you make informed decisions when you need to. So you're like locking in things that make sense once the supplier is brought on.
Yeah.
Not
I
to
mean,
overcomplicate that.
No,
scenario,
it's
but it happens.
it's the next frontier, right? How do we deal with procurement systems that aren't set up for early release type packages or early contracts with subs?
And we've seen a lot of really successful projects, specifically at universities,
Right.
where we do just work in the traditional design bid build. We bring on a partner towards the end. I think it's key to leave a little extra time in the process after the 100% CD.
Mhm.
Like we have a high-end university right now that we're working on, where we actually took on the connection design as like an addendum with the supplier after the 100% CD. Which is a little confusing, but it's like almost like a fourth phase.
Mhm.
And that's how I like to think about it, where it's like, if you're going to do a traditional design bid build, you have SD, DD, CD, and then you have the procurement development phase, which happens after 100% CD, where you refine, ideally as a partnership with the supplier, the drawings past 100% CD
to accommodate the
accommodate
specific
their
vendor that has been selected.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great point. And I think that in terms of the design team budget, there needs to be an allowance for us to go back in as a design team and make adjustments to the design based on the fabricator vendor that's been selected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think maybe I hadn't thought about this now, but maybe we just have to think about it as a fourth phase, and maybe we can even give it a name.
Sure. Let's work on that.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, I think our time's up. Kristina, thanks so much for weighing in on this.
Thank you.
It's an interesting topic that I think we have to all figure out in the industry, but been great chatting with you, and join us for the next session. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Tune in for our next episode, Mass Timber and Fire Safety. And like, subscribe, follow, or comment.